Steering, very similar to brakes. Everybody jumps in their car, put the foot on the brakes, and it works, the car stops. What happens after that, very few people take much interest in, so therefore rack and pinion steering is exactly the same. There's a steering wheel and there's a column attached to it that disappears under the dashboard, down through the engine bay and finishes up somewhere down the front. What you've got down the front is this piece of casting which is bolted to the front of your chassis cross member. It's your whole life. Inside it, there's a rack which slides back in here and can mesh with the gear on the side. I'll show you shortly. Now, the good book says if you have this in here, you should be able to slide it through, and it should take 1.5 pounds of pressure to pull it through, or force to pull it through. Doesn't say whether it's oil or what. And they said if it's not, then you lap it in. Never had a great problem with it myself, and I don't go to that extent trying to do those sort of measurements. When they're assembling it, you have the rack in this position, but it would actually move around and twist itself into another position. So there's got a little slider block which goes back in here to the centre of the rack and keeps it in position and limits the amount of travel that it can take when you're turning your steering wheel. Okay? To ensure you've got some resistance in it, they've incorporated a damper unit. This damper unit has a little block here which goes back in here and bears against the rack itself. Then on top of that they have a spring and a housing which makes a force onto there to give it a shock resistance or loading at all times. They say when you've got that on and fully loaded, it should take about 12 pounds of force to pull it across. If it's greater than that, you have to shim this up with a little spacer block so as to ensure you get the right force. I can't imagine that in the factory a guy was sitting there having to do all these torques and loadings to ensure your rack and pinion was in a perfect position or control with such loadings. As you can imagine from here, the spring in there is extremely strong, and to get it to compress is quite a lot of force. Alright, once you've got that and you've set the whole thing up in that situation, so I put the nuts back on so it doesn't leak out. In a minute. With that setup completed, you can now move across and insert the pinion. This is the pinion which actually drives back and forth off your steering wheel. It's mounted in an eccentric bush, so as when you place this into position and it meshes into the rack in here, as he turned around the wrong way, I'm sorry to say, because the pin fell out. Put the cover back on so it doesn't happen. No, it's not anymore. Now when you put it back into there and you mesh this up, oh, it's upside down, wouldn't it be? It'd have to be, wouldn't it? So when you place the pinion into mesh there and the bush is pushed home, this allows you to turn this bush back and forward. You can hear the backlash that you got in there now. You can adjust this up so you can eliminate the backlash and have a very even mesh on it. In the early cars, the 400, 401 has a cover which goes over the top and clamps it when you get the right amount. So it makes it more difficult to adjust it if you've got it in the car. On the later cars, the 403, they had an eccentric clamping unit here which is able to turn the eccentric back and forward to get your right mesh. Once you've got that right mesh and it's all in position, you can clamp the whole thing down and lock it in position. Then, to ensure there's not going to move back and forward or there's any load on there, there's an adjustment bolt which goes in the bottom in here and makes contact with the bottom of the pinion so as to hold it in the same position at all times and eliminate any of that movement. Now, when you're playing around with it and you want to know exactly where you are, Bristol made it that this end here, when you're in the dead neutral position, that is the neutral position for the car and allows you then to put the adjuster here or the cap here so as to line up with your universal so as to get your position. Okay? So that's all there is in the rack and pinion itself. It takes a bit of time to set them up, and if you do it properly, it's well worthwhile because you get good results out of it. Now, the whole thing's lubricated from your one-shot lubrication system. So the oil is fed in to here for your rack and up here for your pinion. A lot of people turn around and they put grease into the system. If they've changed their nipples over and disconnected the one-shot lubrication because they don't want to have oil leaking everywhere, you've got to remember that once you've lubricated this part of the rack, you then have to lubricate the rest of the system here on the extension because you've got to have something to drive your wheels back and forward. So you have an assembly such as this, which is quite beautifully made. You have a ball joint assembly here, you have a cup inside here, or a ball cup. This fits in the end in here, the ball joint's inside, this goes into here, and then you tighten this unit up all the way until it locks it absolutely solid. You'll notice here though it's got two grooves, one at 180 degrees apart and an indentation mark for a wire clip. So when you tighten this right up to its full extent and lock it and lock the ball joint, all you have to do is take it back one half turn and line it up on the hole. So it goes in position and then you can lock the whole thing up with a lock nut on here. Now, the ball joint assembly, which is in the end here, is hollow or drilled through. The oil that you've lubricated here on the rack now feeds across down here into here, lubricates this ball joint, and then moves its merry way down the bottom down here to the outer ball joint. Now the outer ball joint, I mentioned this the other week when I was here. I left it at home, I think. No, it's in here. You have this ball joint cup and you have a spring. When you're assembling this, you assemble it with the spring in there, but no washers. The ball joint just slips out of there. And if you've been repairing, you would have lapped all this in. You put it in position here, and then you put your bolt through, but you'll find you've still got slack in here. So what you've got to do, sorry, with the spring in there, I won't have any slack, my apologies. We take the spring out, put that in there, put this together, you put the bolt in, and you've got all this slack back and forward in the ball joint. What you do then, you have to get shims, and you keep packing this section here in little shims in behind here, and you keep packing it out till you can just get the bolt in position, and it'll just go into the hole there. When you get in that position, you're now going to be sure that you've got full load on that all the time, and you've got good retention on the ball joint. The biggest problem you have, if you haven't done that correctly, and every time you hit a bump, you'll get a shock back through the steering wheel, especially over a railway crossing or something like that. If you are getting that, you can bet your bottom dollar that's what it is every time. It's that situation. Because when you put the shim back in, you've got the shims back in there, put the spring back inside, put it back together, and put this back over the top, you'll find you've now got to compress this to get it to go all the way. So you've usually got to use a little jemmy bar to pull it up in position and get the bolt to get back in position, and that'll lubricate. So that's where all the oil's coming from, down here, through here, and right down here to lubricate the end. To stop all the gunk getting into here, you have a bellows which goes over the whole system here so as to keep all the dirt out. Now, the other thing you've got to worry about with your rack, you've got to have some adjustment with all this, because otherwise you can't track your car. So you've got an adjustment here. When this is screwed up to X position, you know that you're in neutral there. You can roughly set it up with your wheels dead ahead and get the position here and lock this nut up, and you'll have exactly the same on the other side. If you want to be really set up about it, you can set up a trammel in between your wheels or your rims, and you'll usually set it up to 0 or 1/8 toe in. And when you finish with that, take it back to an alignment people and get them to do the proper adjustment on the machine. But when he does it, he'll have to undo the bellows, slide it back, undo this lock nut, and then do the adjustment so as to get your tracking correct. Any questions?
If, like on my car, that one shot has been removed,
yep,
and you squirt grease in there, the grease is not going to...
No, it doesn't go down anywhere. This particular one was packed full of grease when I took it apart, so as to bring it in here. Because people see a grease nipple on there, it's an oil nipple.
Yes.
I've modified my cars all my life and had oil nipples on here. And I use EP90 diff oil to lubricate it, and I've never had any worries whatsoever with any of my cars.
Okay, so you shouldn't be putting grease in.
No, don't put grease in whatever you do, because you won't be lubricating this ball joint and you won't be lubricating this ball joint. If you're putting new dust covers on this end here, a lot of them split. What I do if I'm redoing a car, I'll put the outer cover over the rubber sleeve, and then I bind it with electrical tape and then put a plastic tie around it so as to stop it slipping. And you'll find they last almost forever, no problem. I've never had any problem with the ball joints here. You had problem with ball joints here because if the rubber sleeve is broken, all the dirt and gunk gets in here and you're finding a fairly high wear rate on it, and the adjustment is quite surmountable at times because of the eccentricity as well. But apart from that, they give very little problem if they're looked after, beautifully made, beautifully machined, and if you're going to have to do some adjustment, like on here yourself, and it was an ordinary 400, 401, you'd have to make up a little tool like this that'll allow you to get in here and move the eccentric bush back and forward to wherever you find the best position of mesh.
And it's not very much movement, is it?
It's very, very small. I had a car come to my place probably 8-10 years ago, and when it arrived, I nearly died. These two bolts were loose, and which means the bloke driving the car, if at any point in time that eccentric bush had moved in the wrong direction, it could have locked his steering and he'd have had no control over his car. Not a bit. So it does pay to check things at times.
So really what you're saying is you either use the make it an oiler,
yes,
or you leave your one-shot
lubrication operational. Yeah, yeah. I prefer to take it off and use my lube system with grease nibbles. I know that then I can pump the oil in that I want to get in there, and I don't have to have it leaking everywhere. By using EP90, your ordinary diff oil, I find it flows quite well. And it gives a nice feel to the steering as well at the same time, and does cushion the mesh between the teeth as well. Any more? No. So that's your rack and pinion steering. Probably nobody's ever seen one pulled apart. Okay.
Oh, thank you.